Welcome everyone to the AP California Annual Legislative Update webinar Part 2. This is second in our series of legislative updates this year. If you were at the conference in Fresno this year, you might have attended our Part 1 session. We've done a Part 2 session because a lot has happened in the last few weeks since the conference. And so this webinar is really intended to do some recap, but also to share new information that's come out. So we're just excited you're in the room today with us. I know Share has opened up the floodgates, so folks are joining, and we'll give just maybe one more minute for those that are arriving a bit late. So thank you. Again, thanks to those that are just joining. So we've got over 100 people in the room so far, so thanks for those of you that have joined. Seeing the numbers slowly trickle off. Still got some folks coming in. Okay, why don't we get started, because I know our time is precious today. We have 90 minutes to get through a lot of material. So once again, welcome to the AP California Legislative Update Part 2. As I mentioned earlier, this is a second in a series of updates this year. The first one was at the California conference in Fresno a few weeks back. We've decided to do a Part 2 webinar this year because a lot has changed. Those of you that were at the conference might have recalled that we were only able to really share updates through what had happened as of right about the time the legislature ended session, but the governor had not taken action on any bills. So we'll be recapping today, but also sharing new information since the governor's bill signing deadline. Just to do a panelist introduction, my name is Erik de Kok. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Legislation for the California chapter. With me today is Tom Pace, the Director of Community Development at the City of Sacramento. He is the Policy and Legislation Technical Advisor. And we also have Lauren de Valencia, who is our Chapter Lobbyist with Stephen George Associates. So we want to say welcome to you. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to do introductions today, but we'll trust that a lot of you are all members or interested in what we have to say today. Just a quick overview of our program in the chapter. We started off the year this year, as we do at the beginning of every two-year legislative session, to update our legislative platform for the chapter. This is basically a document that provides an overview of the top issues that our chapter is concerned about, and also policy positions or objectives that we have as we review proposed legislation in the year. Okay, my slides aren't showing. Thank you so much. I apologize for that. Let me do a quick share. Hopefully everyone can see that. Thank you very much. So the platform, as I mentioned, does focus on key issues like housing, equity, inclusion, and social justice, climate resilience and hazard mitigation, infrastructure services and fees, the California Environmental Equality Act, CEQA, neighborhood vitality and healthy communities and coordinated planning. So that update occurred, at the beginning of this year, and as I mentioned, was a comprehensive effort that was supported by a legislative review team. So just want to say thanks to those that are on legislative review team, as well as our chapter board, for supporting and endorsing that platform update. As part of our legislative program, we also, as I mentioned, do review a lot of bills. Lauren will share a little bit about in a second the big picture overview of this, but we review hundreds of bills each year. This year, we reviewed almost 400 individually introduced bills that had some relationship to planning. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, even just to get our arms around the totality of what the legislator is putting on the table every year. And this year was a pretty big lift, as Lauren will share shortly. Thank goodness we do have a legislative review team. Over 60 folks signed up at the beginning of 2023 to engage with us, to help with those reviews, to provide red flag concerns or issues or comments on legislation early in the process, and that occurred in the March timeframe. The legislative review is open to chapter members for participation, and we do open that up at the beginning of every calendar year. So if you find yourself interested and want to learn more about legislative review team participation, please reach out to us after the webinar. We'll have our emails on the screen and would love to hear from you about your engagement. We also work hard to take positions when it's appropriate. We've issued several dozen letters this year, many in support, some in opposition, or oppose unless amended. And we take careful consideration of when to issue those letters. Sometimes it's not appropriate, or we feel we want to wait until we see how the bills are evolving, and Lauren and I and Tom work together to make those decisions about support letters. More often than not, we do provide technical feedback and comments on bills that we're seeing. We do engage. Lauren's our conduit in the legislature, working with legislative staff, with committee consultants, with other advocacy groups as well. We do a lot of work together to make sure that we're providing technical feedback on bills, expressing concerns, pointing out benefits or good provisions that we're seeing in some of the legislation. So just know that that's a lot of the work that we do in addition to taking some positions and formally expressing those in terms of written letters to the legislature. We do engage in meetings and advocacy related to that activity. There's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes in meeting with those folks as well. From time to time, we do provide public testimony. Either myself or Lauren or Tom will sometimes formally go to public meetings and express our concerns or our support. We do partner engage with other organizations as well. Sometimes this might be other professional organizations, it might be advocacy, but there's a partnership mentality at times to make sure that we're joining forces or aligning our interests and joining unified coalitions at times to make sure we're expressing support or concern in a unified way with other groups. Of course, we do communicate with you regularly. Many of you might see our chapter e-news go out. We do have an annual legislative update that goes out at least once a month that Lauren and I prepare. So if you ever are wondering what's going on, you can always check out that monthly e-news in your email inboxes. From time to time, we will share information on social media. We'll leverage the APA California chapter social media. At times, we'll repost as well from our own individual accounts. But please do watch out for us in social media for messaging when big things are happening or big events are coming up. We do webinars like this one occasionally, maybe 1 or 2 a year max. We also do try to keep our website updated. So we have a lot of stuff online, and I will show you next. As many of you might have seen, the chapter did update its website recently this year. So there's been a big refresh. That's been a big success. We also do have an advocacy page within that new website, and there's a new design called Advocacy, of which you can find a lot of the materials that we do post online. You can find the legislative platform there that I mentioned earlier, and you can read through that. You can see a little bit more information about the legislative review team, what it does, how to get engaged again. Bills and position letters are also posted. So all of those letters I mentioned, if you want to read them, find out what was submitted this year and also in prior years, you can click on that link as well. And a lot of other useful information related to the legislative program. So that really concludes my overview. We're excited to dig in with you and give you the 2023 updates and some recap. So I'll turn it at this point over to Lauren, who will take us through some of the big picture discussions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Eric, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As Eric said, we have a lot to get through. So what I wanted to do before we start going through the individual bills is kind of give you a big picture on what was really going on in the legislature this year and how that really impacted the types of legislation, the budget, and the like that we saw moving through the legislature. So if we can go, there we go. So of course, looking at this slide, and if you've joined us in the past couple of years, you know that housing and homelessness year over year in the legislature have been #1. It continues to be #1. It continues to be the #1 issue that the governor is very focused on as well. And so it's really no surprise that we see so many of the bills, particularly those that we're going to cover today, focused on attempting to address the housing and homelessness crisis in the state. Members in the legislature are under a lot of pressure in their jurisdictions to address this issue. The governor is under a lot of pressure. And so we're seeing a lot of work, continue in the legislature to try to tackle the issue. So There are, I would say, probably a number of bills again this year, as we've seen in the past, dealing with streamlining of a particular type of project, overriding local zoning, some attempts to kind of nibble around the edges around CEQA as it relates to housing. But generally speaking, we're seeing a lot of bills coming, a lot of new ideas coming that were proposed this year, but additionally, a lot of old ideas or bills that would have been sunsetting in the near future, being extended to continue to try to address the issue. I'll also just say that I think it was, and it's been noted in the media quite a bit, but it was also a really big year for the YIMBY movement. There were several sponsored bills by YIMBY organizations that did pass the legislature and were signed by the governor. In fact, I don't think the governor vetoed any of those bills. I think we have two housing bills we'll talk about that were vetoed, but otherwise everything was signed this year. So big issues to address there with housing and homelessness. We're going to also talk about some funding proposals for addressing mental health and the homelessness crisis that Tom will get to in a bit. Moving on, but also very much related, accountability and implementation. This is another issue where in the past couple of years, we've started to see the legislature, as much as they're focused on passing bills dealing with streamlining for housing, certain types of housing projects, they want to make sure that the bills that they're passing are being implemented appropriately. And if not, then they will come back in the legislature and try to plug the loopholes, or they've also given more authority in the legislature. The legislature has given more authority to, for example, HCD through their new housing accountability unit. The Attorney General also has much more authority and has been very active, as probably our attendees have seen, engaging in the housing element update in the 6th cycle currently going on, generally speaking, on implementing many of the bills that have passed. So while we're seeing the legislature continue to pass bills, they're now ensuring that there's actual accountability and enforcement measures tied to bills that have either previously passed or passing this year, and we'll likely continue to see that in the future. And then in addition to that too, we're also just seeing in bills that are passing that have funding tied to them through the budget, new reporting requirements and other types of metrics that need to be reported to ensure, again, that there is a sense of accountability and proper implementation going on. So shifting away from housing and homelessness, go back there. Thank you, Eric. Focused also, the big issue this year for the legislature was climate. The legislature in the past couple of years certainly has focused on certain types of specific issues that are a direct impact from climate change, like wildfires, and more recently we've seen focus on flooding. Obviously, we started the year this year with one atmospheric river after the next that really caused a lot of damage in communities. And so as much as the legislature is focused on trying to address, and we'll talk about a bill that addresses sea level rise, for example, at the local level, we really saw a lot this year dealing with more broad infrastructure that is needed to be able to make sure that we are, for example, meeting the state's target to reach carbon neutrality and reduce GHGs by 2045. Now that target is locked into place and the scoping plan has been updated, the legislature is very much focused on how do we get there. And so there's a lot of discussion going on right now about infrastructure needs, grid reliability, a big discussion this year, and I expect this to continue on the strategies versus hydrogen versus electric vehicle or electric, anything. Electricity versus hydrogen has been a very big contentious topic for the past year, and it was again this year, and it's really going to be, I think, in the coming years, as we're seeing a lot of federal funding coming forward to be able to, for example, create hydrogen hubs here in California, focus more on EV infrastructure as well. So a lot of bigger, broader picture discussions this year around climate and infrastructure. That said, we did have a bill that we will review this year. It's a tier bill, but it's really important to planners, and it deals with a general plan update related to the electrification at the local level. So that's really important, I think, to keep in mind that the legislature is going to not only be focused on big picture, but also at the local level coming forward. And so with the climate and the housing and the accountability, all these bigger themes going on that are very relevant to planners, one of the other big things that was very interesting this year and really influenced the activity of the legislature this year is the fact that we had so many new members in the legislature. It was the largest freshman class we've had in a long time, with a number of very diverse, it was a very diverse group of members coming into the legislature in their experiences, their viewpoints, their backgrounds, and where they're coming from. Some come from local government and some have no local experience. And so it was a lot of also trying to understand where these new members' priorities are. And I think we'll continue to see that, obviously, as we go into the next year, knowing a bit more about them now after having finished this session. But because there were so many new members, we also saw a lot of new ideas proposed and some old ideas resurface. In addition to that, too, I just want to note that we also have new members in leadership positions. We've had some changes both in the leadership in the Assembly and the Senate. We'll continue to see that next year as it relates to chairs of the relevant committees that we as APA California frequently go to. But one that I wanted to note that I think is really exciting is we have a planner in the legislature, Assemblymember Juan Carrillo, who was a planner from the city of Palmdale for a number of years. He is now the chair of the Assembly Local Government Committee, and that happened more towards the end of session. So we're really excited to be able to work with him and have a planner in that leadership position to be able to partner with, we hope, and have a good working relationship with moving forward. And then finally on this slide here, and I'll get into it in details, the budget deficit impacted everything. It definitely impacted the bills that were signed versus what were vetoed, and it also stopped a lot of bills from moving forward this year altogether and not making it to the governor after all. So we can go to the next slide there. So last year when we met at the conference and when we provided a webinar, in the previous year as well, we were fortunate enough to have a huge budget surplus. 2 years of a surplus has now shifted to a very substantial budget deficit, a $30 billion deficit this year for the 2023-2024 state budget that the legislature and the governor had to work together to address. And in doing so, the intention and the outcome of that was not touching key reserves because, frankly, there could be future budget deficit years that are already being projected, at least for next year and potentially ongoing for the next couple of years. And so the budget was passed in June with additional budget trailer bills to implement the specifics of the budget passing later on in session. But it was a very challenging negotiation to try to figure out how to plug that hole without touching those key reserves. And so a lot of what happened were delays and some reductions in commitments from previous budget cycles on specific types of programs to future budget years. Some of the funding appropriations were shifted around from other sources, and there was a lot of negotiations on what was delayed, how much was delayed. But generally speaking, while housing, homelessness, and climate do remain priorities in the legislature, I think they're reflected in the budget as well. There were still impacts to programs within each of those buckets, and especially as it relates to climate. Many of you may have likely seen or maybe involved in a lot of the discussions around public transit and how to deal with just the impacts from plummeting ridership and revenue from the pandemic. And so a lot of the funding that could have potentially helped to address that was potentially on the budget, on the table to be cut. And so there were a lot of negotiations back and forth around the budget impacts to public transit. And for now, I think that there is an agreement and funding is in place to continue to support public transit as needed for the next year or two, but there still needs to be ongoing discussions on how to promote and support a resilient public transit system and grow it ongoing, again, to be able to address the broader climate goals of the legislature and of the state. Additionally, we know that there's a lot of funding coming from the federal government from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So some of that is also hopefully addressing some of the shortfalls that we saw in the budget this year. Additionally speaking, because the climate portfolio in the budget was also impacted, there is on the table for discussion next year a potential climate bond. There were some bills moving this year, they were tabled, and that discussion will happen next year. But on the positive side of things, a few highlights here. One that we're really excited to see, it was 2 lines in the budget summary, and it caught our attention right away. And that is that OPR was provided funding to do a comprehensive update of the general plan guidelines. And that's specifically as a result of many of the laws that have passed and that you all are implementing, to be able to update the guidelines to reflect all that's passed, and also to align the guidelines with California's housing, equity, and climate priorities. So that was really exciting. I don't think the funding was as much as was originally hoped, but it's still there. And on the slide here in a minute, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Finally, the other thing I want to flag here is that there was a 5th round of the HAP grants, the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention grants, and there's an additional $1 billion in that funding. That's not as much as what was advocated for and what was hoped for, but it is still an additional 5th round. I'll just add there that in that area, going back to that issue of accountability, there is new criteria and reporting metrics and requirements to meet existing housing laws in order to access that funding. So again, that's the legislature and the governor really ensuring that accountability there for new funding. Before we move on, I just want to flag, this is something, we didn't know during the conference because the governor hadn't actually acted yet, but what was very consistent throughout all of the bills that were vetoed this year was that the governor was very clear that if the bill had a state cost and it had not been negotiated through the budget, or it created a new ongoing cost to the state to implement, even if it was well intended, all of those bills were vetoed, and the same veto message was provided for in each. That the legislature, essentially, as the governor put it, sent him nearly $19 billion in unaccounted costs in the budget if he had signed the additional bills that were sent to him that he ended up vetoing. And 11 billion of those would have been ongoing costs to the state. So he's been very clear about remaining disciplined about funding for programs and for new programs through bills that had passed. And I am sure that this is going to continue into the next cycle as well as we go into the next session. We've seen projections already that we're looking at another deficit potentially of 15 billion right now for 2024 and 2025. So I think it's just really important that as much as the governor may share those priorities that the legislature sent him, if there's not funding already negotiated for, it's very unlikely to get passed to get signed by the governor. Moving on. And so as I mentioned, the OPR was given funding to update the general plan guidelines, and we've already seen some activity around this. OPR did host actually a webinar yesterday. They've put out an RFI for getting information to be able to start that updating process. And Eric, do you have anything else that you want to add on this slide before we move on? Okay. The only thing I'll just add here is we've provided a link for, if you didn't already receive the alert from OPR, there is the link to the RFI, and there's a survey in there that you can take to be able to provide your comments. I know, as I said, OPR held a workshop yesterday. Comments are due this Friday, so I know that's not a lot of time, but hopefully you've already seen potentially this update go out and this RFI go out. I think there's other ways to engage. It sounds like OPR is planning to put an advisory committee together. They are still, I think, taking comments, even potentially outside of this comment deadline, though I don't want to speak for them. That's just kind of the sense that I got listening to the webinar yesterday. But we're really excited to see, this come to fruition. It sounds like the guidelines, the intention is to have them in place and updated by mid-year in 2026. So we look forward to seeing that happen. And I'll just also note that when I was listening yesterday, It sounded like potentially HCD is maybe also considering simultaneously updating the housing element guidelines as well to kind of target that same time frame. I don't know that that's, you know, a for sure thing, but that's just kind of the sense that I got from the comments yesterday.
I'll
Okay.
just add too, Lauren, that, you know, as the chapter, as part of our program, we do intend to monitor this effort, and we'll definitely keep our members engaged. Look for more updates from us as this process moves forward, including ways that the chapter can potentially support the effort. So yeah, but thanks for the overview, Lauren, much appreciated.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to, as I mentioned earlier, infrastructure was a big deal this year. It was a very big deal for the governor as well. And so that is why, as the legislature was working through the budget, there was also the governor's infrastructure streamlining package that was introduced and ultimately negotiated and passed soon, near the time of the budget being passed as well. And again, this is the governor and the legislature showing the importance of needing to really focus in on infrastructure in order to meet our climate goals here in the state. And so this package focuses on streamlining opportunities for clean infrastructure and energy projects. The governor essentially issued an executive order, and that executive order creates an infrastructure strike team that'll help to work with various state agencies and help to facilitate the planning and development of these very specific types of projects. They fall into these buckets up here that you see: energy, semiconductor, transportation, and water. And so the governor issued the executive order, and then with the legislature negotiated a package of bills that are intended to streamline the process for these types of projects. And, you know, I think we were excited to see this introduced because it put on the table and back in the discussion in the legislature the idea, generally speaking, of streamlining also for CEQA. The package, and I have the list of bills here down below at the end so you can read through them. I highlighted SB 149, which I think will be of most interest to planners. But generally speaking, the package of bills is really intended on addressing streamlining addressing permitting and procurement processes and trying to streamline those timelines. But in addition to that, those projects will also qualify for additional CEQA streamlining related to judicial review. And so these projects will have expedited judicial review to the extent feasible. That language was added into the language when the bill passed. So I just want to flag that for everybody. I thought that was interesting. It'll also address streamlining related to document retention. It will extend the deadline for the governor to provide for streamlining for environmental leadership project certification. And so it pushes that streamlining process out. And then it also does a few other things around shortening the administrative record, and then allowing agencies to deny a request by a petitioner or a plaintiff to prepare a record of proceedings, and sets out a process for that. And so while, you know, it's exciting to see, and it certainly generated a lot of conversation around CEQA streamlining generally, I think, you know, it's important to note that this is really, as I view it, state agency streamlining and projects that will be likely processed and permitted through state agencies, and not so much necessarily at the local level. The other thing I really want to flag here is that when this was introduced, there was very much a sense of urgency that it needed to be done with the budget. It needed to be done this year. It could not wait, even though there were those in the legislature who pushed back on the urgency of these bills that were moving. But the idea here, again, as I said earlier, is really to capitalize on all of this discretionary federal funding that is coming down the pipeline, because there's timelines where this funding could run out. And so the sense of urgency is there. The other thing I just want to flag before we move on is, you know, we talk a lot about secret reform or no secret reform, or, you know, what needs to happen there. The conversation when this started, the conversation around, well, why not streamline for housing projects, also came back up. It came into the conversation. But this was very, very much focused on infrastructure. And so there was not also a separate, you know, package introduced specifically or more broadly speaking around CEQA streamlining for housing, except we will get to a few bills that do deal with more specific types of housing projects and streamlining around there. So let's move on to legislation. And before we do that, I just want to, again, now set the table for how we're reviewing the bills and kind of what we were looking at this year. As Erik alluded to, there were quite a few bills this year in the legislature that we reviewed. The California State Legislature works in two-year sessions. And so this was the first of the two-year session. Next year, we'll pick up on the second of that two-year session. And so generally speaking, bills that are introduced in the first year but don't pass in the first year can be carried over and they're called two-year bills. And they typically, if they don't pass this year and they get parked because the author decides they don't want to move them, they can then be taken up in January when they return. But I have usually there because there is also a set of bills, and we have some that we'll highlight very briefly for you today that deal with bills that are held under submission. And these are bills that have gone to the appropriations committees because they have a cost implication and ended up specifically being held. And so in order for that bill to move again, the author would have to, or somebody else would have to decide to reintroduce it. So just keep that in mind as we're working through the slides. There are some two-year bills that we know will likely move next year and we'll be engaged in. There's some that were held that I think will probably get reintroduced in a different form. And then the other thing is, as Erik said, when we were at the conference and we presented, session had just ended a few days prior. It ended September 14th. And so the governor still had a full month to determine what bills he was going to sign and veto during the next 30 days. And so the deadline for the governor to act has now passed on October 14th. And now we know what has happened. Generally speaking, for this session, we had about 2,500 bills introduced, which is a lot. We had about probably about 1,200 sent to the governor. We tracked about 400. And about 150 of those bills were related to housing. So again, it shows you the focus of the legislature. And then finally, for some stats for you, the governor ended up signing 890 bills and vetoed 156. So again, as we go through the slides, you'll notice we have a lot on the slides, mainly because we want to make sure you're able to, after this session or this webinar today, you can go and look up some of these bills that maybe didn't pass this year or passed, and you might want to get more information about them, but we can't cover it all. So we want to make sure we focus on some of the bigger issues that we think have a more broad impact to planners across the board. And, we keep, as Erik said, we keep our bill lists online. You can see all the bills we're tracking. You can always ask questions to myself or to Erik de Kok if you ever have questions on a particular bill. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Tom.
All right. And I promise I will not be presenting 150 bills here today, but there are, I think, some key ones that we wanted to talk about. First, there are some two-year bills that we wanted to highlight for you. And of those, I wanted to mention that AB 68 was an interesting one, and it's likely to return next year, or it may return next year. This was a joint effort of California YIMBY and the Nature Conservancy to delineate where housing development should and shouldn't go in the state and provide streamlining for urban infill development. It was a very ambitious bill. However, I understand that perhaps recently California YIMBY may have dropped out of its support for this bill. So I don't know, Lauren, if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think we're still trying to understand, what the path will be for this bill next year. We're actually planning to reach out to the sponsors to have a conversation. Certainly, this is a huge bill and was impact planning across the board. But I think that this sets the table for a lot of conversations on this issue. I don't know that if this will be the vehicle or not. But certainly something that we will be engaged in. And if this bill doesn't move forward next year, specifically, I'm sure that we're going to see other proposals similar to it.
Yeah, so something that we'll be keeping an eye on. Another two-year bill that I wanted to highlight was SB 450. And this is SB 9 cleanup, and then that was the urban lot split and duplex law that was passed recently. SB 450 cleans it up by requiring that a decision be made within 60 days or an application is deemed approved. So similar to other streamlined ministerial approval processes that the state has put in place recently. It also removes the ability to deny a proposed duplex or lot split because of an adverse impact on the physical environment. It prohibits objective standards on a proposed duplex that do not apply uniformly to developments within the underlying zone. but it doesn't prohibit a local agency from adopting or imposing standards that are more permissive than the applicable standards within the underlying zone. And it also clarifies that a local agency may impose objective standards for a proposed lot split, so long as they're related to the design or to the improvements of a parcel. We expect that there's likely to be further cleanup legislation on SB 9 in the coming year or in the near future. And then there are a few bills listed here that are held under submission. We wanted to highlight SB 405. We raised concerns. This bill could have removed a perfectly viable set of sites from the housing inventory due to owner opposition. It's not going forward for now, but it's an idea that has favor with certain industry groups. So we will be on alert as we see potential, new proposals along these lines that would require notification or perhaps even more onerously permission of property owners to have their sites listed in the housing inventory. Next.
Yeah, and Tom, before you move on, SB 450 definitely will move next year. I think there were a lot of ideas out there about additional cleanup that should be made to SB 9. Some would not be cleanup, some truly would be. And so we do expect to see that move. And we've also, been given an opportunity to provide feedback if there are other things that are, cleanup potentially that could help make implementation of SB 9 more clear. Please do let us know. And then as it relates to SB 405, which Tom just covered, one of the things that I think that paused this bill or held this bill this year, but will, as Tom said, be an issue to discuss next year is also that HCD has just finished conducting listening sessions. APA actually participated in those listening sessions related to recommendations on the RENA process and the methodology standards and how to potentially refine those. So HCD will be issuing a report to the legislature at the end of this year. And so I think part of what stopped that was potentially the fact that there's a lot of discussions ongoing and this bill may have been premature, but we do know that the sponsors of this bill are very much interested in moving something next year. Thanks.
All right. So here are a few of the bills that were signed by the governor relating to housing and homelessness. AB 1633 was an interesting one. This really came about because of an action in 2021 by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors when they required a 500-unit downtown project on a parking lot near multiple transit stops to undertake additional environmental studies related to the EIR. For those of you who are following it, it was at 469 Stevenson Street. This bill attempts to settle the law regarding what happens when local governments require CEQA analysis beyond what the courts may consider sufficient to make a reasonable determination of the environmental implications of a project. And it does so by adding to the definition of what it means to disapprove the housing development project. That's a defined term in the Housing Accountability Act, disapproving a housing development project. And in the following two instances, when a local agency fails to make a determination of whether a project is exempt from CEQA or commits an abuse of discretion in that determination, and when a local agency fails to adopt a negative declaration or addendum for a project, certify an EIR, or approve another environmental document for the project, or commits an abuse of discretion in that instance. So we will see what implications that has for CEQA practice. It's really intending to deal with decision-making bodies that are trying to drag out the process or impede housing development by adding more onerous and unnecessary steps to the CEQA process. And then AB 1490, this is another example of the legislature overriding local plans and zoning to, in this case, require approval of hotel motel conversions that create 100% affordable housing units with half of the units at the very low income affordability level. Eligibility standards require that the project be on an infill site, not near certain industrial uses, and it has the standard 60 and 90-day approval deadlines consistent with the time limits that you see in SB 35. So if your local zoning or general plan does not allow affordable housing in areas where hotels and motels are permitted, take a look at this bill. All right, next. So here we have a little bit of information about one of the bills vetoed by the governor, AB 309, which would have created the social housing program within the Department of General Services. And the governor vetoed this bill, and there were three kind of main parts that came out of the veto message. First of all, that the bill infringes on state sovereignty over state-owned property by establishing a new process for local government review. Also, the governor objected to this bill because state-owned sites identified as being suitable for housing development were already being developed as affordable housing through the state's excess sites program. And then the last part, kind of continuing on the theme that Lauren mentioned of why bills were vetoed in many cases, was because of new additional cost pressures. So this one didn't move forward at this time, but I think there's still interest in the legislature to try to do something with social housing. The topic seems to keep coming up, so we'll see what happens in the coming years. Yeah, and on this one too, the Assemblymember Lee has tried for a couple of years now to create a new social housing program within the state. AB 309 was actually much broader, and it was kind of narrowed into where it was when it was sent to the governor. But this bill was vetoed again, as Tom said, and as I alluded to earlier, cost issues, duplication. But the other thing that I think is important to note is the governor did sign, and Tom has it on his previous slide, SB 555. Which is a bill that is much more light on the issue of social housing. I think it looks at or requires HCD to look at how to meet the state's housing goals, including through social housing, and issue a report. So, I think that Assemblymember Lee, he's been very committed to the issue of social housing in the state of California and pushing for that. So I do think this one will probably come back in some capacity and perhaps be negotiated in the budget to have more legs to get passed in the next couple of years. All right. So now on to housing law enforcement. As Lauren had mentioned earlier, there's a big push for accountability. And so the governor signed a couple bills here that address that. AB 434 adds current and proposed new laws to the list of laws that HCD can enforce, and it shortens the time frame for HCD to review adopted housing elements or amendments from 90 to 60 days. And you'll see on this list of laws that can be enforced, some of the laws that we're going to be talking about today. And then AB 1485 grants the Attorney General the ability to intervene in third-party lawsuits to enforce specified housing laws. This is in addition to the AG's existing powers to file his own lawsuits to enforce the laws. So it just gives additional power to the state to enforce housing laws, consistent with this theme of accountability. And before you move on, Tom, I just want to flag for everybody, speaking of SB 9, this bill, while SB 9 cleanup did not move forward, part of what was in that was enforcement of SB 9. So it was moved into AB 434 to provide for the enforcement of SB 9. So just keep that in mind. All right. And then on to funding for housing and homelessness. First of all, we see that we have a couple of two-year bills there relating to funding. There was some concern about competition on the ballot for different funding measures. And so the legislature decided to put those items aside for now, but they may appear on a future ballot. But this coming election season, we will be seeing a couple of bills relating to behavioral health. And this is part of the governor's effort to kind of overhaul the behavioral health and homelessness agenda and really steer more behavioral health funding towards the state's homelessness problem and providing care and treatment for individuals who are unhoused, and also to redirect some of the funding for housing to specifically meet the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness who also have behavioral health issues. All right, and then also just to mention, ACA 13 is a measure that is kind of interesting. It would essentially require that any initiative constitutional amendment that would increase the voter approval threshold would itself also have to meet that same threshold. So for example, if someone wants to put a ballot measure on to increase a simple majority vote approval for raising taxes to a 2/3 majority approval for raising taxes, then that measure that made that proposal to change the voter threshold from 50% +1 to 2/3, that measure itself would also have to pass by 2/3. So it's a little bit of a poison pill to try to, I think, discourage those efforts, because there is an effort by a business organization that's already going to be on the November 2024 ballot that would raise the threshold for all state and local tax increases to 2/3. So we'll see how the battle of the initiatives plays out at the ballot box.
Yeah, the ballot initiative next year, the initiatives next year, there's a long list that's growing and growing, and it's going to be very interesting. And I'll just add on this, Tom, that, ACA 1 to lower the threshold for special taxes to address affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, and public infrastructure. This is one that has been a labor of love. Assemblymember Aguirre Curry has worked on this for many years. So I think, talking about, I mentioned new leadership coming in this year, I think this really shows changes in leadership, kind of making the path to be able to get ACA 1 passed and qualified for the ballot next year in November. And then specific to AB 1657, the affordable housing bond, this one was tabled, but definitely will be discussed next year. And this is one that I think, we're excited to see moving as well, one that we supported, because again, as much as we're seeing so many of the bills moving and passing related to streamlining for housing projects and for infrastructure and the like, we also are hopeful to see, funding for these types of projects. And there's a recognition in the legislature that there needs to be ongoing housing funding if we're going to continue to pass bills to require all the streamlining, and if we're going to meet our housing goals, funding has to come with it. So we'll see how the conversation goes next year, but we do know that one will definitely move forward for conversation.
Thanks, Lauren. All right, we'll move on. Now we have a few bills that we'll kind of highlight in a little bit more detail. AB 821 continues a theme that we've seen in the state legislature for the last few years about zoning consistency with the general plan. This law requires a local agency to approve developments that are consistent with its general plan, but are not consistent with the applicable zoning ordinance, either because the zoning ordinance is inconsistent with the general plan or outdated for some reason, or alternatively, would require the local agency to make the zoning ordinance consistent with the general plan within 180 days and provides a legal remedy to ensure compliance. I think the idea here really is to not have projects stuck because they can't get approved because the general plan and zoning are not consistent. So either the agency would have to approve the project consistent with the general plan designation and kind of ignore the inconsistent zoning, or the agency would need to make the zoning consistent. It sets timelines for that. Initially, the bill also required that there be a provision for consistency with the regional sustainable community strategy, but this was taken out. We worked to remove what we thought was an unworkable consistency requirement, given that very few of the SCSs were designed to guide land use decisions in the way that the bill intended. It was also introduced to address gatekeeper policies that require applicants to get project by project approval. And then also we wanted to note that APA worked to increase the amount of time to comply with this law from 90 days as it was originally introduced to 180 days for those rezonings. Next. SB 423 extends the SB 35 law to the coastal zone. So by way of reminder, SB 35 creates the streamlined ministerial approval process for projects that have an affordable housing component. This was originally not something that applied in the coastal zone. And so this was a very controversial action. There's a lot of struggle between maintaining the Coastal Commission's authority while extending ministerial approval to affordable and mixed income housing projects in the coastal zone. This law also extends the sunset of SB 35 by 10 years. It applies to jurisdictions without a compliant housing element, in addition to the other applicability that it has in SB 35. It creates a new pre-application public comment meeting, but it doesn't require project changes to address those comments. So we'll see how that works. It does, however, remove public oversight hearings and requires approval by staff very specifically. And it carves out an exception for equine sites for 6 months when the law takes effect in 2025. So horsekeeping properties got some special treatment this year. Also, SB 423, we think is potentially the most transformative, especially in the coastal zone. This bill extends SB 35 until 2036 and applies it in the coastal zone for the first time. It's going to subject the Coastal Commission and local coastal programs to objective design standards for the first time, which could be a difficult transition as coastal development permits use the classic subjective and often non-specific standards that SB 35 and the Housing Accountability Act have sought to eliminate. Next.
And as you're transitioning over, I would just say for SB 423, this is the one that probably got the most attention in the media and through the legislature as far as housing bills go. As Tom mentioned, the applicability in the coastal zone and the labor standards were the two issues that were the most heavily negotiated and frankly could have potentially stopped the bill from moving this year, but obviously were negotiated and ended up passing. And then related to the coastal zone language, I think that, the hope is that this is potentially a template for other potential bill ideas, such as applying density bonus across, straight across the board in the coastal zone. There's perhaps a lot of conversations that still need to happen around that, but we do know that that will be a potential idea that will move forward next year. And we'll talk about a bill that attempted to address it, but did not this year.
Thanks, Lauren. All right. Another significant bill is SB 684. And this kind of extends the idea of small lot subdivisions. We got lot splits in single family zones. So now we have small lot subdivisions in multifamily zones up to 10 lots with a maximum of 10 units. And it creates two new ministerial processes and the ability to get building permits for subdivision housing in multifamily zones before maps are recorded. The first new ministerial process creates a subdivision process for maps with 10 or fewer lots and not more than 10 total housing units. And then the second process is a ministerial housing approval for the homes that are built on one or more of those lots that are created by this new process. It requires local standards to allow the Mullen densities to be accommodated regardless of local density standards. You may recall the Mullen densities are those densities prescribed for housing element compliance to meet the affordability requirements. So it's typically 10, 20, or 30 units per acre, depending on whether you're in a rural or suburban or urban area. It sets minimum standards for subdivisions, including a minimum lot size of just 600 square feet. Both processes have to be completed within 60 days or the project is deemed approved. And adoption of implementing ordinances would be exempt from CEQA. So communities that want to adopt an ordinance here don't have to worry about CEQA compliance to implement this law. And that's a provision we've been seeing lately in a number of bills. Where they create a ministerial process, they also create a provision that an implementing ordinance is also exempt from CEQA. And most provisions of this bill don't take effect until July of next year, which is 6 months later than usual to help with implementation. So that buys a little bit of time for agencies wanting to figure out how to implement this into their local regulations. And I'll just notice that there's also another equine provision, SB 9. This bill says SB 9 doesn't apply in a horsekeeping zone. So interesting focus on equine provisions this year.
Yeah, and the delayed implementation is something that we saw last year for the first time in AB 2011. And I think it's appreciated because so many of these bills pass that have to be, then implemented in a matter of essentially, the ordinance has to be in place in 3 months almost after they pass. And so this is something that hopefully we'll see more often. And I think we will probably advocate for more often to allow planners time to get these ordinances in place. And it's the same as goes for the exemption for from CEQA for the ordinances as well. We're starting to see that become a theme too, which is a good thing.
Yes, thanks. All right, on to the ADU bills. It wouldn't be a legislative year without some new ADU bills. AB 976 eliminates owner occupancy requirements. So no more owner occupancy requirements may be imposed on ADUs. AB 1033 allows but doesn't require local agencies to permit separate conveyance of ADUs from the main residence. So if you want to allow ADUs to be sold off separately from the main residence, you can do that under this bill. AB 1332 requires a pre-approval process for ADU plans. This originally would have required local agencies to create the plans and approve them and make them available for use in their communities. And we successfully argued that this imposed a huge cost and technical burden on most communities. And so now the bill allows either the private sector and or the local agencies to come up with plans that can be pre-approved once and used on multiple sites in the local community. Any pre-approved plans have to be posted on the agency's website with the plan owner's contact information, and pre-approved plans when used on a site must be approved in 30 days. So essentially it's a shortened time frame just for site plan approval to make sure that the ADU plan fits on a given lot. All right, next. It also wouldn't be a legislative year without some density bonus bills. I wanted to highlight AB 1287, which is aimed at encouraging housing developers to maximize existing incentives to construct affordable units and to provide additional deed-restricted moderate income units. So this is building on previous super density bonus programs from past years. And I think, Lauren, you might have a comment you wanted to share on this one.
Oops, sorry, I was distracted on answering some questions there. It's 1287 you were referring to. Yes, that was the one I was mentioning earlier. It would have applied density bonus in the coastal zone, regardless of the Coastal Act. That language was stripped out very early on. But as I understand it, the author is committed to trying to attempt to move that again next year, especially given the conversation and negotiated language in SB 423.
That concludes our highlight of housing and homelessness related legislation.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Lots to cover. So much we didn't cover as well. So just a reminder of folks to definitely take a look at the full list of bills on our website. Lots more to cover that we couldn't possibly do today. We're going to now shift into some other topics that are kind of consistent with our platform. We're going to start with equity, inclusion, and social justice. And just know that this is a pretty broad framing in our platform. So there's a lot of housing bills that could have been placed here, but we decided to focus this section of our presentation on bills that really centered a lot more on equity, inclusion, and justice specifically. So there's a lot of decisions we had to make and how we frame this. So just know that there's a lot that could have been covered here. A couple two-year bills highlighted on the screen about requiring Department of Transportation, which is Caltrans, to submit to the legislature a plan by 2030 for adding caps to freeway segments that divide disadvantaged, underrepresented, and urban communities. So this is a two-year bill, could be taken up again for consideration in 2024. ACA 10 in particular establishes the state to recognize the fundamental right of adequate housing for everyone in California on a non-discriminatory and equitable basis. So a pretty big policy statement there. If the legislature decides to move that forward, that would be put on the ballot as a constitutional action. Also, ACR 38 would declare that the legislature should utilize federal resources in partnership with state agencies and local entities to reconnect communities with among other things, freeway lids. So what is a freeway lid? I think this is kind of a unique term. It's the idea of decking over or covering over a sunken freeway, right? Creating some connectivity where freeways, again, have divided communities. The governor did veto an important bill that could have been put in housing, but we're putting it here on equity because this would have created a new tribal housing grant program in the Housing and Community Development Department at HCD for the construction and rehab of rental and for sale housing specific to tribal needs subject to appropriations. And so this one in particular, we were supportive of this. Unfortunately, the governor decided to veto for specific reasons that the administration felt that they had already provided tribal set-asides in a number of new programs that were created in recent years. And of course, understandable, there's a different approaches you can take and how you center specific needs of different underrepresented and historically marginalized communities. So, the message also that they're committed to addressing these issues in next year's budget also is on the table as well. So we're not exactly sure what that means and what that will look like in terms of potential for additional tribal set-asides or dedicated programs, and we'll continue to monitor that this year and the years coming. Shifting over to climate and hazard mitigation, one 2-year high bill we did want to highlight specifically was SB 571. This is a bill that would require a development that would, that any development project in certain high fire risk areas submit an evacuation plan to the local permitting agency when anytime that project would have a project size where at least 40 vehicles or more would be generated by the project in the evacuation scenario. There's a lot of niggling details in the provisions of this bill. There's a lot of very complicated technical requirements for the submittal, very detailed traffic engineering studies, a lot of need to vet those findings with local emergency responders and a whole host of other provisions that we don't have time to get into today, but just notice that we took a close look. We did talk to Senator Allen's staff and some other stakeholders that we were partnering with in this review. Some concerns, but also seeing some opportunities definitely for helping to ensure, best evacuation outcomes. So I think we're a little bit mixed on this bill and just hoping that should it come back this year that we're taking a close look at that as it potentially moves forward again. SB 610 also creates new standards for determining fire hazards in a jurisdiction where that could be different from a state fire marshal. Again, 2-year bill, not a lot of time to get into this one, but we'll continue to watch that for the chapter's interest as well. Climate bond is in the November 2024 ballot works. Continue to monitor that. Lauren, I saw you come off mute. Would you like to comment on that?
Nope, you got it. Thanks.
Great. A couple of bills here as well that we're monitoring that were held under submission. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just know that we did review these and monitor those closely as well. There's a commission bill on authorizing blue carbon. That's not moving ahead. SB 511 would have required CARB to publish emissions inventories for all cities and counties in the state. Pretty sweeping bill. I think CARB had a lot of cost concerns on this item. So we weren't surprised to see that get held in appropriations as well. Moving on to bills that were signed by the governor on climate and hazards. SB 272 by Senator Laird creates new sea level rise planning requirements in the coastal zone. Applies to all local governments lying whole or in part in the coastal zone or within the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission or BCDC's jurisdiction. It does require all agencies in those areas to adopt a sea level rise plan into local coastal programs or as a sub-regional San Francisco Bay shoreline resiliency plan that would be subject to BCDC's approval. The timing for this is actually quite a long lead time. Local agencies have until January 1 of 2034 to comply. The funding prioritization for the projects consistent with those plans is also on the table, although there are no appropriations in this bill. I believe a similar bill was vetoed last year, right, Lauren? That had very similar provisions, but I think pushing the implementation timeline out, not creating a direct appropriations pathway probably mitigated some of the concerns of the administration this year, given the budget deficit. Also, one last provision to to highlight here is that state agencies must provide guidance for implementation and compliance with these requirements by December of next year, December of 2024.
Yeah, and Eric, before you move on to the executive order, I think just to note, as Eric said, this was a 2-year bill, SB 272, related to sea level rise. On the previous slides, Eric talked about SB 571 and SB 610 dealing with wildfire, the WUI areas and development in the high fire hazard areas. That has probably been an ongoing conversation for the last few years in the legislature, and it's really a challenging one that I think we will continue to see. I know there's some organizations hoping to move some legislation in that space. I think Senator Allen has already started up his conversations, but it really is a challenging conversation on how to deal with developing in hazard areas. At the same time, though, trying to address the housing crisis and needing to be able to develop, and where do you develop and how? And so there's just a lot of ideas out there. And we, for the past few years now, have been very engaged on previous bills that were moving. One was sent to the governor and vetoed. So we are likely going to be participating in a working group. It sounds like that is being put together to have this conversation again for the next year. And I think this is going to be another big year or another big issue for next year to focus on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lauren. Continuing on the theme of hazards, we're going to shift a moment away from legislation to talk about a really important executive order as well as a regulatory proceeding that has begun in the Department of Insurance. A lot of folks on this webinar are probably fully aware of the fact that major insurance carriers are leaving California. There are either continuing their non-renewals or in the case of State Farm and Farmers and a few other Allstate, major insurers have decided to stop issuing new policies across their suite of insurance products, which is, of course, great concern to all of us. We need to have affordable insurance, but the reality is that climate risk is growing and there's not enough action being taken to mitigate that risk, and insurance companies are concerned. There was an attempt, an 11th hour attempt, and I'm sure Lawrence can give us more details in a moment after I get through the executive order items here. There was a last-minute legislative attempt to try to create a legislative solution for this. It did not happen before the deadline, before the legislature ended session. The governor then quickly issued an executive order calling on the Department of Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara to take swift regulatory action directly to address this issue. Some of the key components of the executive order are highlighted here. We have expanding choices and stabilizing the market, a better rate approval process, and not stated on the slide necessarily here, but California does not permit insurance companies to use predictive modeling to account for climate change directly in its rate and risk modeling. We're unique. As progressive as we are of climate, there are other states that actually allow this, that also have high extreme hazards and risk, but California is not historically and does not allow this, and it's in the regulations. So that's really what this speaks to, is allowing insurance companies to price risk differently, using different types of tools that factor in for future risk and growing risk under climate change. So the idea is a better rate approval process, stabilizing the market, allowing insurance companies to consider those risks. It's also about maintaining the solvency of their FAIR plan. Some folks may know that the FAIR plan is the state subsidized insurance carrier of last resort. When private carriers will not issue a policy, homeowners and landowners have the option to look at the FAIR plan as an insurance plan of last resort, and it's expensive. It's double or even more the cost, or triple or quadruple the cost of a private carrier. So the idea is to maintain the solvency of that insurance option of last resort. Also accelerating implementation, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the Department of Finance as well to support the rulemaking. If you want to see a copy of the executive order, we've provided a link here, and of course, there's a lot more information that we could provide, but just don't have time about some of the immediate steps that Ricardo Lara and the insurance office have taken in the rulemaking process. Lauren, did you want to comment at all about the legislative fix?
The short of it is that there were a lot of people, a lot of members trying to negotiate a deal literally on the last week of session, and it completely fell apart. So this is kind of where we ended with, and perhaps there will be more legislation needed next year for some cleanup around the regulatory process. So we'll see. I also saw a comment in the Q&A that the link doesn't work to the executive order. So let me find that for everybody and I'll paste that into the Q&A chat.
Thank you, Lauren. Moving on to infrastructure services and fees, a couple important two-year bills just to quickly highlight. There have been some attempts this session to kind of create new infrastructure financing tools and redevelopment tools. SB 901 would create Affordable Housing Finance District, and then AB 30, the Friedman bill, would authorize a concept known as the Reinvestment Infrastructure for Sustainable and Equitable California, or also sometimes known as RISE districts. And this proposal was introduced before in the previous two-year session, so it's come back. We continue to monitor that and have some interesting thoughts and questions for the author, and but are carefully watching some of these important attempts to provide more options and tools for district financing using tax increment financing and other tools. Couple of bills were held under submission in this category as well. We have AB 1504 that would require local agencies to complete a plan for installing EV charging in the right-of-way. I think there were a lot of concerns about this one, given that it seemed to somewhat duplicate other existing efforts that are trying to promote the broad distribution and installation of EV charging infrastructure, whether it's in the codes or incentives. It just didn't make it this year. Also, SB 83 would have set timelines for investor-owned utilities to connect projects to the electrical grid. That was an idea that a lot of people liked because it kind of made the utilities play by the same streamlining procedures that local governments are being asked to perform by, but that just didn't make it through and was held under submissions and appropriation again this year.
And it's worth adding, we didn't include it on the slides, but there was another bill that passed AB 50. It's much more broad, but it does require the PUC to take a look at this issue. So if you're interested in that specifically, take a look at that. We included SB 83 because we were asked specifically to support this bill.
Thanks, Lauren. Then on to some of the bills that were signed by the governor this year in this category. We have AB 516, the Ramos bill that imposes additional reporting and disclosure requirements on local agencies relative to the Mitigation Fee Act. Definitely take a look at some of those provisions if you're concerned about that. It's just really more reporting and disclosure and some of those requirements building on what was already in the act. AB 965, the Juan Carrillo's bill. Again, this is our friend, the planner in the legislature this year, new to the legislature. This bill would require batch permit processing for 2 or more broadband projects, and specifically, it would allow the agency to set reasonable limits and then on the number of permits that can be batched, and it does not preclude local agencies from requiring compliance with any requirements that you already have the authority to impose relative under existing law. AB 1317, Wendy Carrillo's bill, requires the property owners of new multifamily residential properties to unbundle the cost of parking from the costs of the housing unit. So this is an unbundling concept that we have seen before for those that work in CEQA mitigation for greenhouse gas emissions or air quality, or folks working on climate action plans. This is not an uncommon tool in the toolbox for reducing VMT and reducing emissions. But now it's on the table as a mandatory provisions for certain projects and in certain counties. And let me read this through. It would apply to properties consisting of 16 or more new residential units, and only to units that are issued a C of O on or after January 1 of 2025. Okay, so this only applies to new units constructed moving forward as of 2025. And it only applies in 10 specific pilot program counties, and they are, as shown on the screen, Alameda, Fresno, Los Angeles, Riverside, Sacramento, San Bernardino, San Joaquin, Santa Clara, Shasta, or Ventura counties. So the county or any cities in those jurisdictions, this is where this would apply and kick in 2025. There are certain exemptions here. It does exempt certain properties, including residential properties with individual garages that are functionally part of the property, fixed garages, or 100% deed restricted affordable housing units are also exempt from the unbundling. There are other clarifying provisions you should take a look at that involve both tenant and landlord protections in specified circumstances. We don't have time to get into all of those details today, but just know that there's a lot more in the bill related to this unbundling requirement. So if you're one of those counties, read this one closely. There's a lot we can't cover today. And finally, AB 1309, the Quirk-Silva bill, would prohibit parking requirements for single-family remodels, renovations, or additions. Moving on to a specific bill, again on the theme of parking, AB 894 from Friedman does impose new shared parking requirements, and there's a lot of nuance here that we'd like to talk through. This was signed by the governor, and it requires a local agency to allow sharing of underutilized parking with the public, local agencies, or other agencies if those entities should submit a shared parking agreement to the public agency. So it's not an out-and-out requirement, but is a requirement to allow that option subject to a shared agreement being put forward for consideration, okay? Local agencies must allow parking spaces identified in the shared parking agreement to count towards meeting eligible automobile parking requirements for a new or existing development or a new change in use. If a shared parking agreement is used, the local agency must approve it if A, it includes a parking analysis using peer-reviewed methodologies, and B, secures the long-term provision of parking spaces or affords the opportunity for specific review and approval by the public agency. Additional provisions that are worth highlighting here on this: local agencies may not require parties to enter into a shared parking agreement. Okay, so this again is in line with the original bullet on the slide. You're supposed to allow it, but you may not require the use of shared parking as a solution. It's only if parties enter into an agreement as an option to satisfy requirements or to take advantage of the concept of underutilized parking. Now, for projects with 10 units or more, or 18,000 square feet or more for non-residential, noticing is required and a public meeting is required if requested. The provisions of this bill do not apply to local agencies that have already enacted an ordinance that provides for shared parking agreements, including those enacted on or before January 1 of 2024. So I know there's some jurisdictions, including one in the room. I know the city of Sacramento and maybe some others, folks on the call would be one of those that have already taken action on shared parking. There are also, again, other provisions that apply and numerous other exceptions, more minor on scale, and please read the bill, the full text of the bill for all of those details. And I will say this is one where we did work with Friedman's office and did quite a bit of work behind the scenes to review the provisions, review the amendments as they came forward. Lauren, did you have anything to add there?
I would just say, this is kind of building on addressing parking standards throughout the state. Assemblymember Friedman was the author of the bill last year that eliminated parking minimums. And so, I think we'll continue to see bills that address parking standards. But this was one that, as Eric said, we did work to try to help to refine the language. Some of the language, though, I think, comes from various different groups that were involved, and committee consultants and members in the legislature who wanted to see certain things, including that noticing requirement, which was not something that we had suggested.
Thanks, Lauren. Moving on to AB 1176, the SBUR Bill for Local Electrification Planning Act. This was not signed. This did not even pass the legislature this year. It did become a 2-year bill, but we're highlighting it here because this is one that we took a significant amount of time in reviewing and a lot of engagement with the author and other interests, other parties who were concerned. Originally, this bill would have required just another mandatory general plan element that was focused solely on electrification. We did work with the author and with our partners in our coalition of interested and concerned parties to really make this bill a bit more broad and flexible. And as it stands in print right now as a 2-year bill, it would require a local electrification plan, decarbonization plan, energy plan, or other similar plan to be adopted on or after January 1 of 2025. But no later than 2028. We helped to create some flexibility here. Originally, I said it was going to be a new standalone element, but it can be a standalone plan. It could be integrated in the general plan. There's no absolute mandate that it become a new general plan element. So what is electrification? What are the decarbonization energy electrification requirements here? Really quickly, the pieces of the plan have to include expanding EV charging to meet the needs of current and future residents and visitors, and businesses. It does have to identify where infrastructure may be needed for public and private medium and heavy duty EVs or zero emission vehicle fleets. There are some provisions that also apply to electrification of new and existing buildings. And of course, we've already seen a lot of early adopters of this. And of course, with a recent California Restaurant Association lawsuit at the city of Berkeley, against the city of Berkeley, we know there's a little bit of uncertainty and did talk a lot about this concern with the bill author. So we know that just continues to be a moving target and a moving set of goalposts in terms of what's possible in that space, but know that that's something that we were watching closely on as well. The bill would also identify grid updates more on the utility side with load serving entities. And then last, but definitely not least, and this again could have been an equity component as well, the plan has to address the needs of disadvantaged communities, low-income households, and small businesses for investments in zero-emission technologies to directly benefit this group. So there's definitely an equity thread, really important piece of the bill that we definitely gave a lot of praise to as well. Before we're getting very close to the end here. So where the last category is on coordinated planning, neighborhood vitality, and healthy communities. Again, we just wanted to highlight one specific set of bills. I won't go over everything on the slide here as we're running short on time, but we did want to highlight AB 1000 and AB 1748 in particular. These are two fairly similar bills that would create new standards and basically restrictions on development of warehouse facilities near sensitive receptors as defined. I don't have all the specifics in my hand to go over all of the provisions of these bills, but just basically know there would be some pretty serious restrictions on the siting of warehouse and other what we call qualifying logistical use type facilities, and the bill has a very explicit definition for that term. There are similar provisions, but they're different in scope and scale. And if we had a little bit more time, we would have been able to unpack that a little bit for you. Again, these are both two-year bills. There's still possibly that the legislature would take them up again this year, which I think we can expect to see. We expect those to continue to evolve. I know there's been a lot of interest from the advocacy community, the environmental justice community that's really concerned about the proliferation of warehouse facilities and their impacts on people of color and historically marginalized communities. And there's also a lot of concerns in industry groups as folks are looking at expanding warehousing to meet demand at the local and regional scale. Oh, let's not forget about CEQA. That was not the last category. How could I forget about CEQA? Really quickly, a couple important two-year bills here. AB 340 would add some limitation on last-minute claims of non-compliance with CEQA, again, trying to avoid the late hits. Interesting provisions. We're a little bit confused by some of what we saw, some concerns about how it could affect the response to comment time period and public publication of the final EIR. So just know that we were taking a close look at that one, but that became a two-year bill. AB 692, back again this year with a different number. I know there was previous attempts in the last two-year session to exempt egress routes for fire safety from CEQA. This is just another attempt in that series of policy work. We're reviewing that one closely as well as the year begins again next year. In the interest of time, I am going to skip ahead to the sign bills. AB 356 would extend until January 2029 the existing provision that waives the consideration of aesthetic effects under CEQA for projects that refurbish, convert, or replace derelict buildings. AB 1449 exempts from CEQA certain 100% affordable housing funded projects through, and this is an incorrect reference. It should be the California Tax Credit and Allocation Committee, not the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. We meant to create a correction in the slide, it just didn't make it in time. But just note that when we get the slides uploaded, that'll be corrected in the record there. So really other important bills, SB 91 eliminates the sunset date for CEQA exemptions of converting hotels and motels to supportive or transitional housing. Prior bill that put that exemption in place did have a sunset date, so that's now gone. And then SB 406 establishes a CEQA exemption for actions taken by a local agency to provide financial assistance or insurance for low and moderate income residential housing. There's some slightly different provisions in 406, a little bit of overlap with what we see in 1449. So definitely read both of those bills closely, as they both have to do with creating some streamlining for affordable housing. Another important bill, kind of the more famous of the issues that came forward in the last few years, was AB 1307, which responds to the People's Park case in UC Berkeley, where UC Berkeley was attempting to build an affordable housing project on a community park. And the findings of the really significant pieces of the case that turned into CEQA issue had to do with noise, and that a lot of the community in the CEQA litigation was trying to argue that students generating noise, large groups of students leaving, let's say, a student housing project built on the site late at night would cause a CEQA impact from noise from talking or shouting, or whatever students like to do as they leave the places where they live. So a lot of folks, the way that the appellate court decision came down, were very concerned that this could set a bad precedent, that any new residential development in any urban area would automatically require an EIR because of a noise impact from people talking as they're leaving a building. So the legislature responded, and it came in the form of AB 1307, the Wicks bill, which amends CEQA to clarify that for residential projects, the effects of noise generated by project occupants and their guests on human beings is not a significant effect on the environment. Okay, so a bit of an important bill here in terms that it sort of creates a kind of more of a boundary around the noise analysis in CEQA in the context. It does not exempt, obviously, automobile traffic leaving a site, even if it's a residential project, right? It does not say you don't have to look at other noise sources in CEQA still. So, but it does create some boundaries around noise analysis from noise generated by people. It also amends CEQA to change the alternatives analysis requirements for student housing projects, residential or mixed-use housing projects promulgated by institutions of higher education. And some of the provisions here must be on a site no more than 5 acres and substantially surrounded by urban uses. And the second provision basically points to the projects having to be consistent with the long-range development plan EIR. This automatically sort of narrows the applicability of this alternative streamlining down to UC projects, given that UCs prepare long-range development plans and those EIRs in particular. SB 69, the Cortese bill, does introduce a new CEQA notice filing requirement. In addition to filing your mandatory notice of determination with the county clerk, this bill now introduces a new requirement that those notices also must be filed with the OPR state clearinghouse at the same time, right? And so OPR through the state clearinghouse has the CEQAnet tool. They facilitate online submittals and postings. So presumably you would use CEQAnet for your submittal of your electronic notice to get that NOD posted within those posting timeframes. It also, of course, authorizes a notice of exemption. Notice of exemptions are still not mandatory. They are, you may file your notice of exemption with OPR as well, and you can use the same process that you would with your NOD. The bill does require OPR to make sure that those notices, for whatever reason, there's no delay, that they have to be posted on CEQAnet or their website within 24 hours of receipt. And nothing in the bill changes applicable time periods for challenging an act or decision of a local agency. So nothing in the bill changes all of the other requirements relative to those notices. It really just has to do with where and to who you submit those notices for posting. That concludes our overview of the legislation in this session. Now we're almost at time. I know a lot of questions have come up in the chat, so we will do our best to answer those in the time we have remaining. And Lauren and Tom, you and I can conspire behind the scenes to figure out what the best process is for kind of addressing some of what we're seeing on the screen. We did want to quickly highlight the APA California. We did have a special recognition of our 75th chapter anniversary. There was a special Senate floor presentation this year that took place in May. Fortunately, myself, as well as our chapter president, Andrea Aus, who I know is on the webinar today, were able to receive and be recognized on behalf of our statewide chapter for our 75th anniversary. So you see on the left, Senator Caballero, on the right, Senator Atkins, who at the time was Speaker Pro Tem. It was really great to receive that recognition for all the work that APA California has done in working with the legislature over the years. So it's a proud moment for us. We displayed the resolution on the stage at the conference as well during our legislative update session. It is now in our chapter archives. So anyway, we just want to say thank you so much. We know we're at time. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to myself, Lauren, or Tom. You can see our email addresses here on the screen. Our contact information is also discoverable also on the chapter's website, apacalifornia.org. So with that, I want to say thank you. And I think we're ready to get close. Did I miss anything else, Tom or Lauren, before we close?
I don't think so. And we've been trying to answer the questions as we go. I think the biggest, for everybody to know, the slides will be posted on the AP California website. They will be going out in the e-news tomorrow. As Erik said, please ask us questions if you have them after this session today. And there's a lot of really good questions in here, and hopefully when the general plan guidelines get updated, some of that gets answered, because for a lot of these bills that pass, there's not necessarily requirements for model ordinances or guidance documents or things like that. So they're great questions, and we don't necessarily have those answers, but we're trying to answer as many of these as we can.
Great. Well, I just again want to say thank you for joining the webinar, and we'll be back in touch very soon. Feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions for us. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.